everyone, it's Alice, and today I want to share with you some books that I feel like are perfect to read in autumn. I know not everyone is like this, but I love reading seasonally and letting the season that I'm in sort of inspire what I read, and I love it when I find a book that I feel like is just perfect for a particular season. And because fall is my favorite season, obviously I love books with sort of autumnal vibes. I've tried not to go too overboard though, and I've tried to pick books in sort of genres that I like reading this time of year. So we have some witch books, some mysteries, some dark academia, and some graphic novels. And I've tried to pick different kinds of books within those sort of subgenres. And I could recommend a lot of books that are perfect for autumn, but I've tried to limit myself a little bit because if not, we would be here all day. Let's start with the witch books, shall we? And we're starting off strong here with a fantastic book that I read last fall. It's Magic Lessons by Alice Hoffman. And this is a part of the Practical Magic series. It's one of the prequels, but you don't need to have read the other books in the series to read this. This is historical fiction, and in here we get to see the origins of the Owens curse, which follows all of the women through all the generations of this family, and through all of the books we get to see sort of where all of that came from. And it's set in the 1600s, and we meet Maria Owens, who is brought up and she's taught the nameless arts, and then she falls in love with a man who abandons her, and she decides to follow him from England to Salem, and she eventually invokes this curse that will haunt her family for generations. I've read all of the books in this series and I love them, but this one is my favorite. And I think the reason that I love these books so much is that Alice Hoffman is such a good writer and she's such a good storyteller. And she weaves together characters, plot, and settings just so incredibly well, and it feels really magical. The second one I have is also historical fiction, but it's set a little bit more recent. It's The Witches of New York by Amy McKay, and this is set in the 1880s in New York, obviously, and we meet these two women who run this magical tea shop, and they hire this younger girl to work there, and it doesn't take them long to see that she is also touched by magic. But then pretty quickly things start getting a little bit weird, strange things start happening, and then there's also people in the city who are starting to point fingers and saying that certain things are the work of the devil. I remember really loving the setting of this. It felt really vibrant, and I love all of the I don't want to give anything away, but the supernatural creatures that we see in here, I really liked all of that. And I feel like this is a really good blend of historical fiction and supernatural stuff. I do also want to recommend something a little bit lighter though, and I feel like Payback's a Witch by Lana Harper fits that perfectly. I just think you sort of have to go into this book with the right expectations, and those expectations should be something witchy and magical and pretty light with some romance in it. You kind of have to take the good with the bad in this one, but it is really enjoyable. It does have a particular sort of snarky tone to it though, which I think can be a little bit love or hate. It follows a witch who is not particularly powerful, and she's from this magical small town, but she hasn't been there in ages because this guy from one of the most powerful families in that town broke her heart. But then she returns because there's this spell casting tournament. I feel like that doesn't really tell you what it is, but it is a sort of tournament that involves all of the magical families in this town. She has to return for that because she has to do this particular job. And then she gets there and she meets this woman from one of the other families, and it's just a lot happens in here and it's a lot of fun. There's some romance, there's a lot of magic, and it's set in this absolutely you can't find a more autumnal small town than this. And it's also set in the weeks leading up to Halloween, which is perfect. It is sometimes a little bit ridiculous. It's a little bit over the top, or a lot over the top sometimes. And there are some scenes that feel like weirdly YA, but I got really invested in this book. I don't know what it was, but it just sucked me in. And I had such a good time when I read this book, and sometimes that's all you want. Then we have another one that is sort of on the lighter side as well, but this is more full-on fantasy. It's The House Witch, And this one is cozy fantasy, and it's not set particularly in autumn, but there's something really, I don't know, because of the cozy vibe, I just feel like it's perfect for this season. This is set in a magical world where we meet this character who starts working as a chef for the royal family in the royal castle. And he is a piece of work. He is really rude and he rubs everyone the wrong way, but there is a reason for his rudeness, and we sort of spend some time exploring that, and eventually he makes friends and connections, and he gets involved in a lot of things in this castle. There's some romance, there's a lot of magic, there's a lot of food in here, which I particularly enjoyed, and it's just like filled with cozy vibes, and it's very enjoyable. It is kind of book that sets up a lot for like the next book, so not everything is finished by the end of this, because I don't know, I just felt like it set up a lot for the next books, which is fine, but just beware that you may not get all of the answers by the end of this. But super, super enjoyable, and there's also a very, very cute cat in here if you're into that. Moving on, we have some mysteries, because I feel like they're obviously perfect for this time of year, and we're gonna start with one of my favorite mystery books of all time. It's And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. I know I mentioned this book often, so I'm not gonna go on about it too much, but this is a classic mystery, and it tells the story of 10 strangers who are all summoned to this island, and they seemingly have nothing in common, but then it turns out that all of them have a dark secret in their past, which someone has decided to punish them for, and they start getting killed off one by one. The setting of this is just so atmospheric, and one of my favorite things about this book is that the atmosphere gets progressively darker the further into the story we get. It's also just a really twisty and well-crafted mystery, which is not surprising because it is Agatha Christie, after all. The second one is one that, again, I feel like you sort of need to go into it with the right expectations, because it's good and it's worth the read, but it's not like the perfect book. It's The Maidens by Michaelides. And I feel like if you go into this just expecting an enjoyable read with an academic setting and a slightly obsessive main character, and you're just expecting something sort of fast-paced and something you can just read quite quickly, if you go into it with those expectations, I think this can be a very enjoyable read. I unfortunately went into this with like sky-high expectations, and I think that that affected my reading experience of this quite a lot, but I did like it, and there are parts of this that I still think about. The story is about this woman who ends up going to Cambridge to visit her niece because one of her niece's friends go missing, and she's later found murdered. And this main character starts getting really involved in that case because she just convinces herself that one of the professors of the school had something to do with it. And it's not without reason. It's because this professor has this like group of young girls around him all the time, and they call themselves the Maidens. So there is something weird going on with that. The thing that makes this perfect for fall is the setting and the atmosphere, which I remember really, really enjoying. And there is something really intriguing about like a murder mystery, and there might be a secret society. Like, it has a lot of elements to it that I really like, and I do think that this can be like great if you just want like an enjoyable read that you can just fly through. Then we have some short stories. It's Sleep No More by P.D. James, and this has obviously a very lovely autumnal cover, and it has 6 short stories in it that are all mysteries, and I don't want to tell you too much about the stories because I don't want to give it away, but I remember when I read this, I was really impressed with how well crafted the characters and the plot felt, even though the stories are so short. I don't read a lot of short stories, but these are some of the ones that I've enjoyed the most, and they have this like golden age of mystery vibe to them that I love. We then have another book that I read last year that is more of sort of a horror-leaning mystery, and honestly this freaked me out quite a lot. It's The Silent Companions by Purcell. This is historical fiction, and it follows this woman who becomes a widow 3 weeks after having gotten married, and she's sent off to live in her husband's, like dead husband's estate. And this whole place is just like really weird. The village next to it, like everyone hates the people in this estate, and the servants are really rude, and everything is just weird. And then, to make it weirder, they find these wooden companions in the attic. And then these companions start like popping up everywhere. No one knows who has moved them. And it's all just really freaky. This is about as much horror as I can take, but I am very easily frightened, so take that into consideration. But I thought this was very creepy and eerie, and it's perfect for fall because the setting is really like, if you imagine a huge estate in like a really foggy place where like the sun never shines, like that's the vibe, and maybe it's a little bit haunted. Who knows? Then we have a dark academia section, and we're just gonna get this first book out of the way. It's The Secret History by Donna Tartt. I never stop talking about this book because it's my favorite book, so I'm not gonna talk about it too much. But if you're gonna read this book, the perfect season for it really is fall. Even though this is set over a whole academic year, there's just something about it that feels very autumnal. It is a little bit on the slow side though, so you have to be into that. I would also recommend this, which I feel like this and The Secret History, like those two books are very often bunched together. This is If We Were Villains by Emma Rio, and in this one we meet this man who is released from prison after having spent a decade there, and when he gets out, the detective who put him there is like waiting for him because he wants to know the story of what actually happened back then. And then we go back and we meet this group of 7 students who are studying Shakespeare at this elite college, and we get to hear like the whole story of everything that happened. Although the stories are different, I very often refer to this as sort of The Secret History light. And I mean that in a good way. Like, it's still like really well written. It is a little bit of a shorter read, and I think it just feels a little bit lighter because I do think, although it's my favorite book, The Secret History is quite a heavy book. It's a little dense, and I think that this has some of the same vibes, a similar sort of setting, and some of the same themes without feeling as like heavy, and you get the same vibe. And it's a really, really good book. There's also a lot of Shakespeare stuff in here that I ended up really enjoying. I've never really read any Shakespeare. I'm familiar with some of the plays, I've seen some of them, but I've never read any of it. And that part of the book ended up being like surprisingly enjoyable for me, and I really liked it. The next one I have is sort of back on the more slower, heavier side. It's Stoner by John Williams. And this follows a man born at the end of the 19th century who grows up on this farm, but his parents end up sending him to university to study agriculture because they think that that will help with the farm. But then when he's there, he falls in love with English lit, and he ends up changing his majors and becoming a professor instead. And we basically follow this one character throughout his whole life. Honestly, this is kind of a sad book in a lot of ways because the main character has so many disappointments in his life. But then there's also this other part of him where he has this really vivid inner life, and he just loves literature. And you read about his love of that and how that sort of carries him throughout his life, which was just lovely. It is a character-driven book though, so if you don't like those kinds of books, you're not gonna like this at all. It is very much just about this guy, and stuff happens, yes, but it's very much about the character, and I loved reading about him. Then we have some more fantasy with Babel by R.F. Kuang, and this is again historical fiction. It's set in the 1800s, and we follow a main character who is brought over from China to England after he's orphaned and he loses his mother to cholera. And this mysterious professor brings him to England and sends him to school to study language in preparation of him entering this like prestigious institute at Oxford University, which is famous for translations and magic. When he eventually makes it to Oxford, he makes some friends, and he loves like the pursuit of knowledge and learning, but then eventually he starts questioning what they're actually doing there and the consequences of what they're doing, and maybe he wonders if there is something darker going on. If you like fantasy and dark academia, this is a must read. Like, it's the perfect book if you like those kinds of things. And there's so much in here about language that is really interesting. I think the magic system is really cool. The setting is fantastic. And I really enjoyed following the main character throughout this. And it is a little bit long, I think, and it does drag a little bit, but I feel like it's worth the read either way. Next, before we move on to the final category, we have These Violent Delights by Micah Nemerever. And this is set in the 1970s, where two students meet as university freshmen, and they are immediately drawn to each other and they become friends. But it's really intense and it starts becoming all-consuming, and then things just really go off the rails. It's a little hard to explain this book without giving it away, but it's so good. It's really well written. It is really intense and there's a lot of emotion in here, and it is a character-driven novel again, so you kind of have to be into that, but things happen as well, and we're following these two very interesting, complex people, and it's kind of dark and very tense, and yeah, it gets pretty dark. Then at the end here, we have two graphic novels, both of which are just very sweet and wholesome. The first one is Pumpkinheads by Rowell, and this follows these two friends who for years have been working together at this pumpkin patch, but it's their last year working there and their last shift together before they both move off to go to college, and they decide to spend their last shift having this sort of adventure. This is a very sweet story about friendship and growing up and sort of moving on, and the color palette is really autumnal. It sort of becomes night at the end, but especially in the beginning, there's a lot of orange and there's like bonfires and s'mores, and the whole like setting of this, like obviously a pumpkin patch, that's very autumnal and it's just really nice. I also love this character in particular because she ends up sort of eating her way through the sights. Like, they go on this adventure together mostly because of this guy, and she sort of pushes him because there's something happening with that. Again, I don't want to give it away, but she just like is so food motivated, and I just loved that. Lastly, we have one of my favorite books actually. It's Garlic and the Vampire by Bree Paulsen, and this is about this character named Garlic. She's on the cover here, and she lives in this village of vegetable folk, and they are sort of resided over by this witch named Agnes, and she lives there and they're all happy, it's all great, but then a vampire moves into the neighborhood, which is a little bit concerning, and the village folk decide that they need to send someone to confront the vampire and sort of check it out. And they decide to send Garlic, who is very anxious and very reluctant to go on this adventure, but she ends up going. This is very sweet and wholesome, and it is a simple story in a lot of ways. Like, you're probably not gonna have your mind blown by this, but if you need something to cheer you up one day, this is perfect. It also has a really wonderful autumnal palette, and it's just a perfect, sweet little pick-me-up, and especially this character, like, you just gotta love her. That was the last book though, although again, I could recommend many, many more, but those were all the books for today. Now, I'd love to hear all about your favorite autumnal reads. If you know of a book that is just perfect to read during autumn, leave a comment so everyone can get even more recommendations, and I can also get recommendations. Even though I shouldn't get any more books because I have a lot, I would like getting more recommendations, and especially autumnal ones. So tell us all about it in the comments, and yeah, that was kind of it for today. As always, thank you very much for hanging out with me today, and I will see you soon. Bye!